Julia Bennett had always believed in fairness. Growing up in a modest neighborhood in Manchester, she was raised by parents who instilled in her the values of hard work, integrity, and the conviction that the world, despite its flaws, offered equal opportunity for those willing to strive. From an early age, Julia dreamed of making a difference, of climbing the ranks not merely to earn accolades, but to be a beacon of change and empowerment for others like her. As she graduated at the top of her class from a well-regarded university and accepted a promising role at a leading multinational firm in London, Julia's heart swelled with hope and determination. She was convinced that meritocracy would reward her diligence and that talent alone could carve a path to success. But as the months unfolded, Julia's hopeful optimism began to erode against a harsh reality she had been largely shielded from in her sheltered upbringing. The corporate world, she realized, was a labyrinth of subtle prejudices and invisible barriers, many of which were cloaked under the guise of tradition and business as usual. Julia noticed early on how her contributions in meetings were frequently overlooked or sidelined. Her ideas, when presented, would sometimes be echoed back by male colleagues and praised as novel insights, leaving her feeling diminished and invisible. Invitations to after-work gatherings or informal networking events were seldom extended to her. Opportunities where relationships were forged and careers quietly advanced. In team projects, Julia often found herself assigned to tasks considered less strategic or critical, her efforts undervalued despite her qualifications and commitment. At times, these exclusions were so subtle that Julia questioned her own perceptions. Was she reading too much into these occurrences? Was she perhaps too sensitive or overly ambitious? But the recurring pattern was undeniable. In a world that championed equality, her experience was one of marginalization. The glass ceiling she had heard about from distant media stories and academic discussions was not a myth. It was a tangible, frustrating reality. The barrier was not always made of glass, but woven into everyday interactions, unspoken expectations, and deep-rooted cultural biases. Julia's frustration was compounded by moments of outright sexism that, though infrequent, left a lasting sting. On one occasion, a senior colleague made a dismissive comment about her emotional responses during a high-pressure meeting, undermining her authority. At another time, during a corporate retreat, a joke was made at her expense about women being too delicate for leadership roles, laughter erupting around the room as if such antiquated ideas were benign humor. Julia's discomfort was met with awkward silence or quick topic changes. No one seemed willing to challenge the status quo. Seeking guidance, Julia confided in her closest friend Mark, who had joined the firm a year earlier. Mark listened attentively, affirming that Julia's feelings were valid and that the company's culture did seem to harbor unconscious biases. Yet even his encouragement was tempered by realism. "It's just the way things are," he said once. "You have to play the game to win it." The words felt like a compromise that Julia was unwilling to make. More disheartening were the conversations Julia had with women who had weathered the storm longer than she had. Helen, a senior manager and mentor, spoke candidly about the compromises women made, how many accepted being sidelined to keep peace, how they softened their voices to avoid confrontation, and how they bore the emotional burden silently. Helen's own journey was marked by sacrifices that Julia was only beginning to understand. "The system isn't broken," Helen once said. "It's designed this way. You can either swim against the current or find ways to navigate it quietly." But Julia's spirit was restless. She refused to accept the status quo. Determined to carve a path for herself and those who would follow, Julia began meticulously documenting instances where gender bias influenced decisions. She collected emails where her ideas were ignored but later praised when repeated by men. She noted meetings from which she was excluded and disparities in pay and promotions. This evidence became both a shield and a sword, a way to confront injustice with facts rather than frustration. Julia also sought allies within the firm, quietly connecting with other women who had faced similar challenges. Together, they formed an informal support network, sharing stories, strategies, and encouragement. Their group pushed for the establishment of official diversity and inclusion initiatives, lobbying management to increase transparency in promotion and pay policies. They organized workshops on unconscious bias and equitable leadership practices. The process was slow and often met with resistance. Some leaders viewed these efforts as unnecessary. Julia felt the weight of her battle, but she also carried the flicker of hope that change was possible. The progress she and her allies had initiated was real, though slow and fraught with resistance. At work, small victories started to reshape the landscape. The firm's leadership, faced with mounting pressure and undeniable data, agreed to pilot flexible working hours and establish clear criteria for promotions. Julia became an integral part of these efforts, pushing for transparency and accountability. Despite these advancements, the deeper currents of bias proved persistent. Many of Julia's male colleagues, some unaware of their own privilege, occasionally dismissed the new policies as token gestures. Others voiced concerns about lowering standards or reverse discrimination. Julia confronted these attitudes not with anger, but with facts and empathy, understanding that fear of change often masked underlying insecurities. Her advocacy extended beyond the office. Julia began volunteering with local organizations supporting women re-entering the workforce after maternity leave or career breaks. She encountered stories that shook her. The skilled women who, after taking time off for family, faced hiring managers skeptical of their commitment or abilities. These women struggled against assumptions that their professional skills had atrophied or that family responsibilities would detract from their performance. One woman, Emma, shared with Julia how her job interviews were dominated by intrusive questions about childcare arrangements and flexible schedules, topics that male candidates rarely faced. Emma's frustration mirrored Julia's own experiences, but came with added burdens. Julia recognized that gender inequality was multifaceted, intertwined with expectations around motherhood, caregiving, and societal roles. She realized the struggle was not just about gaining entry or promotion, but about reshaping fundamental perceptions of what it meant to be a woman in the modern workplace. At home, Julia's activism prompted new conversations with her family. Her mother, initially cautious, grew more supportive as she witnessed Julia's resolve. "I want a different world for you," her mother said one evening over tea, "one where you don't have to fight so hard." Julia's father, once reticent, expressed pride mixed with concern. "It's a heavy burden, but your fight is important." Julia's social circle also evolved. Friends who once saw gender issues as abstract became engaged, attending workshops and sharing stories. Some men in her life began to confront their own unconscious biases, opening dialogue rather than shutting it down. In the broader society, Julia saw mixed signals. Media coverage on gender inequality increased, with powerful documentaries, articles, and social campaigns sparking awareness. Yet, backlash movements also gained traction, often using social media to ridicule or discredit feminist efforts. Julia understood that the cultural battlefield was as intense as the corporate one. At the company, Julia's role expanded. She was invited to join the Diversity Council officially and lead initiatives aimed at creating inclusive leadership training. These programs focused on recognizing unconscious bias, fostering empathy, and promoting equitable evaluation processes. Julia's voice carried the stories of countless women, turning abstract data into human narratives. One particularly challenging project involved revising the firm's maternity and paternity leave policies. Julia advocated for equal parental leave, arguing that supporting fathers' involvement in caregiving would reduce the disproportionate burden on women and challenge outdated gender roles. The proposal faced skepticism, with some questioning its impact on productivity. Julia persisted, bringing in research from countries with progressive parental leave policies and testimony from employees. Eventually, the firm agreed to pilot a more equitable parental leave program, marking a significant shift. Yet, challenges remained personal and systemic. Julia faced moments of burnout, the emotional toll of continuous advocacy coupled with high work demands. She grappled with imposter syndrome, wondering if her voice was loud enough or her efforts impactful. During these moments, Julia found solace in writing. She began a personal blog chronicling her experiences, reflections, and hopes. The blog resonated widely, attracting a community of readers who shared their stories and encouragement. Through her writing,
Julia realized that her battle was part of a collective struggle. She was one thread in a vast tapestry of voices demanding justice, respect, and equality. Julia's relationships deepened with others fighting for change. She connected with activists from other sectors: education, healthcare, politics, each confronting unique but intertwined forms of gender inequality. Together, they strategized on policy advocacy, public awareness camp.
Years passed, and Julia's name became known not just in corporate circles, but also in wider social justice movements. Yet she never saw herself as a celebrity or icon. She remained grounded in the stories that had ignited her purpose. The ignored intern, the overqualified woman denied promotions, the exhausted mother trying to balance caregiving and ambition, and the countless others who were told to be quiet, to wait, to settle. Her influence reached far beyond her company. Other firms took notice of her work. Some called her in as a consultant, others invited her to speak to their boards. She used each opportunity to center real voices, to remind decision-makers that gender inequality wasn't theoretical. It had names, faces, and consequences. One such opportunity came when Julia was invited to speak before a European Parliament commission reviewing workplace equality laws. The room was filled with lawmakers, journalists, lobbyists, and advocates. Many had never worked in a regular corporate environment. Fewer still had ever been made to feel less than because of their gender. Julia didn't begin her speech with statistics or policy points. She began with a story. She told them about Maria, a single mother who had to choose between feeding her child or keeping her job. About Nia, an engineer who trained dozens of junior men who all leapfrogged her to senior positions. About Priya, who left the workforce after being asked too many times if she was too emotional to lead. "You ask why this matters?" Julia said, her voice steady. "Because we are losing talent. We are draining creativity. We are silencing vision. And we are telling half the world they have to work twice as hard for half the recognition." The room was silent, but she could see their expressions change. Rigid faces softening, some nodding, others taking notes. Afterward, a young assistant approached her in the hallway. "That was the first time I heard someone say out loud what I've been thinking for years," she whispered. Julia smiled. She knew the speech had done what it needed to do. Back at home, Julia's blog had evolved into a full platform, with contributors from across the globe. What began as a small collection of personal thoughts had grown into a hub of stories, resources, and empowerment. It offered mentorship programs, webinars, and an annual summit on workplace equality. Despite the recognition, Julia stayed deeply involved in the day-to-day. She still met with women one-on-one, reviewed company policies line by line, and challenged unconscious bias wherever she saw it. But the struggle was shifting, becoming more complex. As remote work grew in popularity, new challenges emerged. Women were often expected to be more flexible, available at all hours, and still maintain household responsibilities. The visibility that once helped push for promotions now faded behind screens. Julia recognized that the future of work required vigilance. She began researching how digital environments were recreating old inequalities in new forms. Algorithms in hiring software filtered out applicants with career gaps, disproportionately affecting women. Virtual meetings allowed some voices to dominate while others were ignored. In response, Julia collaborated with technologists to create tools that flagged biased language in evaluations, suggested inclusive practices for virtual meetings, and encouraged equitable workload distribution. She insisted that inclusion must evolve with technology. At the same time, Julia began mentoring a younger colleague, Zoe, a passionate data analyst who reminded her of herself a decade earlier. Zoe was driven, idealistic, and sometimes overwhelmed by the sheer scope of the work. "You don't have to fix it all," Julia told her one afternoon, sipping tea on a rooftop cafe. "You just have to push where you are." Zoe nodded. "Sometimes I feel like I'm screaming into a storm." Julia smiled. "I know. But every time you scream, someone else hears. And then they speak. That's how storms shift." Zoe would later lead her own movement, focusing on tech inclusion and fair AI practices, building on Julia's foundation, but creating her own legacy. In the meantime, Julia's personal life, once blurred and pushed to the margins by her mission, began to find new balance. She met a partner, Elena, at a leadership summit. Their connection was immediate but unhurried. Elena, an investigative journalist, understood the emotional and physical toll of speaking truth to power. Their lives intertwined not in competition, but in mutual care. They respected each other's callings, supported each other's burnouts, and reminded one another to rest. With Elena, Julia found safety, not the absence of struggle, but the presence of someone who believed in her fully. They moved into a modest home outside the city, with a garden that became their sanctuary. On weekends, they cooked, read books, hosted friends, and allowed themselves to be just Jewel.